Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. I've done a couple of videos on how to re-gear a Superduty Dana 60, which is going to be very similar to a Dana 44, Dana 30, Dana 80. They're all kind of similar as far as how you set up the carrier and your pinion from start to finish all the way through in one video. Well, we're going to get started. The Superduty 60 you see behind me here is going in my Project CJ5. Now that project, the Rock Gobbler, is basically being built just to be on the rock crawling side of a rock bouncer. Super strong stuff, full hydro steering, 2-inch links, 1.25" heims. I mean, everything is just being built to be super strong. But today on this video, I've already disassembled this Dana 60, pulled off the brakes, the knuckles, the axle shafts, and at this point, all we have to do is pull out that carrier and pinion and start to put it all back together with our Yukon gears and our locker. With that diff cover off, it's time to start to prepare our carrier to be removed. Everything's clean, everything's drained, I've sprayed it with brake cleaner, and we're ready to go. But you're gonna need a bunch of tools in order to do this job. Some of them can be kind of expensive, but they don't have to be. And even if you buy the quality version, but maybe the slightly cheaper version than the professional tools, it's still cheaper than paying someone else to do all this labor for you. And that's only if you do it one time. If you do this more than once, it certainly pays for itself. But anyway, let's step on over to the workbench. Let me show you the first tool that you're gonna need that you probably don't have in your toolbox. Now you're gonna need a set of metal punches. Now this set's pretty complete. It's got the entire alphabet plus a bunch of numbers in it. And I pulled out a capital T. Now, along with that capital T punch, I have it loaded into a set of vice grips. These you probably have in your toolbox, but I have it set up in there, and we're gonna use a pretty heavy hammer. This one weighs about 5 pounds. These bearing caps are the first thing that we have to remove. It's basically the only thing that holds your ring gear and your carrier inside of your axle. We're gonna remove all of this so we can replace it with our new ring gear and our air locker from Yukon. But these bearing caps are super important that you keep them in the orientation they are. You want the top still on the top, you want the left one on the left and the right one on the right. They're machined to be perfectly round inside of here. You don't want to mess that up. I'm going to take my letter T and I'm going to stamp it on this side, and then I'm going to stamp the housing over here. That way I know that this is the top, it lines up with that stamp, and this is the orientation. I'll come over to this side and basically turn my T sideways, do the same stamp over here. With those bolts loosened up, I remove the bearing caps and make sure to put them in a safe place. For me, right underneath the axle next to a jack stand works, but for you, put them wherever you're not gonna lose them. Now at this point, it's generally pretty easy to lift your carrier out of the axle. Those bearing caps, like I said a minute ago, are the only thing that hold it in. But here's where the next specialized tool is going to make this way easier, especially when it comes to setting up your gear pattern later in the video. On the 14 bolt, we had barrel adjusters over here that basically set our bearing preload on our carrier. Well, on this axle, you'll notice that we don't have barrel adjusters. There's actually going to be shims between the bearing and your carrier in order to set up that bearing preload, and that makes it pretty hard to lift this out of there. Now, case spreader is a tool that can be kind of expensive and you don't need it for a lot of the Dana series axles, but on something like a Dana 60, it's a good idea. While it's one of those things that I highly recommend, it's not 100% necessary. It's just gonna save you a whole mess of time when it comes to re-gearing your axle, especially when it comes to getting your pattern, setting your pinion depth, and all those kinds of things, which we're gonna talk about later. Now, I bought this one off Amazon, and as you can see, it's pretty dirty, it's pretty well used. Although it was marketed for a Dana 60 in that Dana series of axles, was actually a little bit too narrow, and that's why you can see I modified the bottom of it. All I did was cut it, throw a piece of plate on it, re-weld it, making the bottom 1 inch wider, and now it works for the Dana 60. You may have noticed these holes in a lot of the Dana series axles, and that is actually for your case spreader. But that's the tricky part. When it comes to spreading your case, it doesn't like to spread. It doesn't like to bend. So it's important to only spread it just enough to be able to get that carrier out. Once it's out, you want to immediately release the pressure and go back to continuing with your gears. Only use it and only use it as much as you need to in order to actually make this job easier for you. We're gonna use it, get this going. With it locked in to those little holes or dimples on each side of the casting, you can see I have the adjustment on top and I've actually marked it. So in order to spread the case, we're actually gonna have to grab this with a big adjustable wrench and pull it toward us, pull it toward the bottom in order to spread the case. When it comes time to relax it, we're gonna go the opposite way. I labeled it just to make sure that I remember. At this point, I've done this a number of times, but if you're new to doing this, you're gonna wanna make sure that you actually label it. You don't wanna be turning it the wrong way and accidentally spread your case too far. It's just an easy thing to wind up doing. So now I can actually feel this getting pretty tight as I'm starting to pull it. It's starting to put a little bit of pressure on the carrier. It was loose when I started. It isn't anymore. So I'm gonna give it maybe another half turn, and then I'm gonna sit there and try to see if that's enough to lift the carrier out. You wanna check that several times because like I said, and I'm gonna reiterate again, you don't wanna spread it more than you need to. So go slow, go easy, check it a bunch of times if you have to, and you'll start to understand what it feels like. There's no doubt that the truss across the top of this axle is gonna make me have to put a little bit more pressure into it in order to actually get it to spread. But we're only talking a couple thousandths of an inch. Once we take that pressure off the carrier, it's gonna lift right out and make our job really simple. That truss made that way harder to get out. I really had to wrench on it. I know you didn't see it on the video because it was just taking so much time. You got the point, but I really had to wrench on that case spreader. It was crazy how much harder it made the case to spread. I've done it before with other trusses, but that's just a testament to this Artec Industries truss, because other trusses, they don't seem to mind. I mean, you spread that case, it's no problem. This one was insane. I have the carrier on the workbench, and there is the inside of our housing. But at this point, that's next on our list. We're gonna take the pinion out. Now, if you're reusing your pinion, you're gonna wanna put something nice and soft and cushy under the housing because it's gonna fall out and hit whatever's under it. I don't care, I'm not reusing it, but I do wanna protect my garage floor, so I'm gonna put like a furniture pad or something underneath it, and we're gonna get it out. So let's flip it over, let's get back to it. With your 1 5/16" socket on your impact, we're just gonna zap off that pinion nut. Make sure that you hold on to this pinion nut. We're gonna need it for reassembly. We only wanna use the new nut on final assembly. Next, you guys can just simply take out the yoke. I'm gonna stick this off to the side. I always stick all of the parts that I use when I disassemble these axles off to the side. Sometimes you use them for comparison purposes against new seals or bearings. Other times you're gonna use them to make tools to help us put the new bearings back on. So I always hold on to everything until it's time and it's done, and then I can throw it all out. Now you're gonna use an old crappy screwdriver and your hammer again. Basically get out this pinion seal. You can use a pinion seal removal or a seal removal tool. It doesn't always work all that well, so I just use an old crappy screwdriver and pound it out with a hammer. There we can see, obviously destroyed. You'd never reuse it anyway, but there's our pinion seal. With our pinion seal removed, you can actually see that we have a thrust washer in there. We actually have the spring from our pinion seal. We'll get rid of that. We have our thrust washer in there and an outer pinion bearing. Now, sometimes you can look down in there and actually see your crush sleeve. We're going to assemble this axle with a crush sleeve eliminator for a lot of reasons. I'll get to it when we talk about it, but this axle is not going to use a crush sleeve. It's just a weak point. We're going to get rid of it. Sometimes it comes out with your pinion, sometimes it doesn't. Ours, in this case, did, and this is what it looks like. Basically, it just slides on top of your pinion It kind of looks like this, just basically a metal sleeve with a bulge all the way around the inside of it. Now that's what the factory uses to set your pinion bearing preload. We're going to do it a little bit differently in a way that it won't change over time or get messed up if you ever have to disassemble it and then put it back together. Now it might be hard to see on camera because everything's kind of dirty, but we have our outer pinion bearing race. We also have an inner pinion bearing race down in there. You can kind of see that little shiny part there, and there's a baffle. So at this point, we're going to go back to the brass punch. We're going to work our way around the perimeter of that baffle and that inner pinion bearing race, knock that out. We'll flip the housing back over. We'll basically knock out the outer pinion bearing race, and we'll move on. We'll talk about what we found. Same thing on the other side. Give it a couple of good hits. To the other side. And now it's time to knock out those inner axle seals. There's a lot of different tools out there on the market for stuff like that. A lot of them cost actually a lot of money. You don't have to get all that creative. Anybody doing this job, right, swapping a Dana 60 axle into your Jeep, or even rebuilding a Dana 60 axle, you're gonna have a hydraulic floor jack. Use the handle, okay? It's super long, it's steel. The one end is flat. It basically gives you a great place to hold it and hit it with a hammer. The other end is a great diameter to get into your Dana 60 and knock out those inner axle seals. There are two different style axle seals for the Superduty Dana 60. And in my left hand here, you can actually see the style that Yukon Gear and Axle sent me, which is a one-piece seal style. It actually goes down into the axle tube like this, with this flared edge facing toward the end of the axle, and this side facing toward your carrier in the center. And then you have this style, which is actually a two-piece design. It actually moves a little bit in there, and these are awful. Kill them with fire. So there's a lot of different tools to press in axle seals. I like this one. This one came with basically something that's supposed to fit in there. It doesn't. I deformed it, so I can't actually get that guy in there, but we don't need it anyway. This is pretty cool because it actually fits through the seal perfectly, and then the diameter of it mates up to the outside. And because of how it's created here, it basically presses on this outer edge of the seal perfectly. It also leaves me enough room to kind of put it in there and tap it with a hammer and get it into place. I really like this tool. I'll link to it in the description. It's kind of expensive, but the other cheap tools that are out there on the market don't work as well, and you'll wind up messing up your seals, and it just wastes a lot of time. I'm gonna put a tiny bit of RTV along the edge of this. You don't really need to, but I like to. And then I'm gonna wind up sliding it in and hammering it in. You wanna make sure you tap it in evenly. And with that seal in there, it's now time to move on to the next step, which is gonna be to mount our new ring gear on our new locker. So I went on over to my Yukon Gear and Axle ring and pinion set and removed the ring gear and pinion. Now they both come in a pre-oiled bag to prevent them from rusting inside the packaging. And I basically just started off by counting all of the teeth all the way around on the ring gear as well as on the pinion. Now, taking those two numbers and dividing them is gonna let you know what the gear ratio is. Ignore all the stampings around the teeth. You just wanna double check it. And that's a real quick, easy way to know what gear ratio you have. This one came out to be a 5.375, so 538. We're good to go. But with this out and cleaned up, right? Some brake cleaner made some quick work of it. We're gonna flip it over and expose the back side. Now, from the machining process, putting all these holes in it with all these threads, you're gonna wanna make sure that there's no burrs on anything. And although it feels pretty smooth, I'm gonna go around it really easily, really nicely, softly with a file, just to make sure that there's no burrs. When we set this up, we're gonna be going within 3 decimal points to the 1,000th, right, with a TH at the end. So a little burr on the back can change the run out, affect your gear pattern, and you're just gonna have to unbolt everything again. So let me show you how to do it the easiest way that I know. Both of these things are machined to an extremely tight tolerance. I'm gonna try, just for showing you guys, to get this ring gear down over the locker, but it's probably not gonna work. I've actually never had it work. So let's give it a shot. I'll show you what I'm talking about. I'm not even concerned about lining up the bolt holes on this with the bolt holes on here, because I know it's not gonna fit, but I'm just gonna show you guys what I mean by that. I'm gonna slowly drop it down over. Look at the size of the gap between the ring gear and the flange that this is supposed to sit on. Some people are tempted to use the ring gear bolts to actually start putting them in and use those to actually suck the ring gear onto the carrier, and that's a really bad idea. When you do a Dana 60, your master install kit's gonna come with new ring gear bolts, and that's because they're likely to stretch, and you don't want them to stretch, right? That weakens them, they'll break, and the last thing you want is the head of a bolt rolling around inside those gears and that diff fluid and just destroying all of your hard work. So what I'm gonna do is actually go inside my house, heat up my oven, and we're gonna bake a ring gear. Now, you don't wanna heat it with a torch because you'll superheat certain areas and you won't heat other areas as well, and you'll potentially compromise the ring gear. It's not really a good idea. You wanna bake it nice and evenly. I've seen people do it on a barbecue grill, but I can set the timer inside my house, take a drink, take a break, hang out with my family for a few minutes, heat this thing up for, I don't know, 20 minutes or so to about 350 degrees, then come back in and drop it right on. But before I do that, I like to take a Sharpie and just mark on the outside edge of the carrier where my bolt holes are. I do that for 3 or 4 bolt holes. And then I'm gonna do the same thing on the ring gear. Now what that's gonna allow me to do is stand here off to the side, lower it on, and hopefully have everything lined up, because this machine surface right here and the machine surface on the inside of this ring gear are so tight that once you drop it on, if it's not lined up, honestly, you usually have to use a brass punch and a hammer to get it off and do it all over again. It can be a little bit frustrating, but if you take your time, it's actually not that big of a deal. We are fresh out of the oven. Hopefully those bolt holes are lined up. All right. It's gonna cool really quickly, but I'm gonna flip it over, put it back on the workbench, and then you're gonna see that I have 3 bolts around the top. They basically are just there to hold the ring gear into place as it cools and squeezes itself down onto the locker or the new carrier. With this now nice and cool, obviously I can touch it, it's no big deal. It's time to now torque down all of these bolts. Now I'm gonna go basically an X pattern, kind of like you would with lug nuts, until I'm all the way around, making sure I've torqued it nice and even. But the trick is to make sure that you use new ring gear bolts, these came in your install kit, and that you clean them. Those bolts come coated in oil, and they do that to, once again, prevent rusting while it's in the packaging, but that oil is gonna prevent that red thread lock from actually doing its job. So you wanna clean them off. A little bit of brake cleaner, no big deal, takes it right off. It's very easy. Now I'm gonna take this locker and I'm gonna put it in a pretty big vise over here. You can see it spreads out pretty far. That allows me to put it in there and lock it onto this section of the vise without actually grabbing my bearing surfaces. It is really important to preserve those surfaces. You don't want any little nicks, scratches, or anything in them. So I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna lay a towel over it. I'm also gonna bear hug it, grab it with the torque wrench, and the specs, according to the install book that came with my gears, calls for 110 pound-feet on all of them. Once that's done, we'll move on with the next step. Now guys, I took that locker and that ring gear after torquing on all those bolts, wrapped it up in the bag that our ring gear came in, and put it down there on the floor taped shut. That'll prevent it from flash rusting anywhere that the oils were cleaned off of it, right? Which is part of the process of getting that done. Now it's time to talk about the pinion, because we are gonna set up the new pinion a little bit differently than the old pinion was set up. And here's where it gets a little bit confusing. Because we are setting up that pinion a little bit differently than the original pinion, there's a couple of things that we have to talk about, and we have to also make some setup bearings and a setup race. I've already pressed on the new inner pinion bearing. That wasn't all that difficult. At this point, you should know how to press bearings on. There's YouTube videos talking about it. You just want to make sure you press on the inner race only, get it squeezed down nice and tight. Don't worry about any shims or anything. That's part of what we're doing. It's going to make this setup a little bit different than the old one. All right, so we have our new pinion and we have our old pinion. Obviously, the pinion heads are very different in size, and that's because this is a 538. This is the factory 373 that came in the axle. Now this is basically how this pinion was assembled in the axle all the way down to the pinion nut. Pinion depth is the first term, and you're gonna get a better understanding of it when you see me set it up in the axle, but that essentially controls where that pinion head, where the gear of the pinion rides inside the carrier. Closer to the center point of that ring gear makes it deeper, and further away from the center point would make it more shallow. Pinion depth on our original pinion was actually done with shims between this inner bearing and the pinion head. Now we didn't do that on this, we just pressed it on because we're gonna put our shims in a different place. And in order to do that, you're gonna need to remove this race, the inner pinion bearing race, and make a setup race. I've already done that with an old inner pinion bearing off of an old Dana 60. I keep it because I build these axles fairly often for my projects and I don't want to have to redo it every single time. So I'm not going to show you how to do it, but I'll tell you what you need to do, and it's really not all that difficult. You're just basically going to take your grinder with a flap wheel, grind down the outside edge of this inner pinion bearing race. Make sure you don't touch the inside, and make sure you don't touch this edge of the bearing or the back edge of the bearing. We don't want to change the bearing race's thickness. We just want to change the overall outside diameter. The reason we do that is so we can basically just drop it in by hand and then remove it by hand. Because when it comes to controlling the pinion depth, we're actually just gonna put some shims in here between our baffle and that race. And then we can take it apart very easily by hand, adjust those shims to adjust our pinion depth and dial it in. I'll explain more, you'll see the process when we actually get to it, but that's an important step to make this much easier than it was. We're also gonna have to talk about pinion bearing preload. Now, to put it very simply, pinion bearing preload is basically the distance between your inner pinion bearing and your outer pinion bearing. The distance between these, if you decrease the amount of space in there, it squeezes these together tighter, puts more pressure on the bearings in their race, and that equals more preload, more resistance when it comes to turning it. If you increase that space, there's not as much preload and it's easier to turn the pinion. Pinion bearing preload is extremely important, as are all the other specs and all the other steps along the way when you're rebuilding your axle. None of it's overly difficult. You just have to make sure that each step is within spec and your finished product is going to be awesome. Back here is how we control our pinion bearing preload. Our factory pinion actually has what's called a crush sleeve, and our new pinion, we're not going to use one. We're actually just going to put a couple of shims in here. Yukon has actually made this portion of the pinion to be taller to take into account for some of this space that this crush sleeve sets up. We'll just put some shims on there and be good to go. But in order to do that and not have to press that bearing on and pull it off constantly, you're going to want to make this bearing a setup bearing. So we're going to remove our pinion bearing nut, the washer, the thrust washer, and then our bearing. Now, making this a setup bearing is actually pretty easy. All you want to do is grind down the inside. You basically just want to hone it out. You can do that with a Dremel and like a barrel type sandpaper type disc on that Dremel, and just spend some time grinding this out and honing it out and getting it to the point where you can take your new pinion and just slide that guy down on there and then lift it off instead of pressing it on in the press. So now let's get the baseline for our pinion depth, and we're going to do that by taking apart the original pinion. We have the nut and everything taken off the top from before. We're going to remove our crush sleeve, stick that off to the side, remove that race. We're gonna remove our baffle and stick that off to the side. Our inner race. And then we have to use our clamshell bearing remover tool to actually pull this bearing off and expose the shims that are gonna be between it. So we're gonna take this tool off of our clamshell bearing tool kit, the same one we used to press on that new inner bearing, basically put it on top. Now we're gonna lower this bottom ring here just till it makes contact with the top of the bearing cage. Obviously it's touching. Now we're going to take our clamshells, and if you'll notice that one end has a smaller hole, one end has a larger. This larger one is to actually grab the bottom of our bearing. So you're going to want to get it under the cage of the bearing and then over the top. And then you just want to raise this upper ring so that it's just barely touching the bottom edge of the clamshell. We're going to take the other one, put it on the other side. I'm going to drop the retaining ring over the top. Tighten that down with that nut, finger, hand tight. I mean, you want it tight, but hand tight's enough. Tighten this down just until it's touching the top of the pinion. You'll feel it. It'll get kind of tight. Now we're going to hit it with our impact and it'll suck the bearing off. Now we're going to loosen up the retaining ring. Basically pull our cups off. That was our original inner bearing. And that means we can come over to the bottom of this and actually remove our shim or shims. In this case, it's just one pretty thick one. With our original baffle and our shim, we're gonna measure both of these things with a set of digital calipers and then write down those measurements separately off to the side. Your baffle has obviously been destroyed by me pounding it with that brass punch to get it out. But you can definitely find some places on it that are not destroyed, and that's exactly where we're gonna wanna measure. With my calipers zeroed out, yeah, 21 thousandths. Now we're gonna check our shim the same way, zeroed out. Our shim looks to be 38 thousandths. We got our old baffle at 21 thousandths. Our old shim was 38 thousandths, and that gave me a total of 59 thousandths. So I went over to my master install kit, got my new shim, cleaned off all the metal before I put it in the calipers, and it actually is the exact same 21 thousandths, which means I'm gonna go back to my install kit. I'm gonna grab the shim pack that came with it, and I'm gonna build a shim pack to make up that difference of about 38 thousandths, just like our original shim, and wind up putting it back together. Now, like I said, clean off all the oil, measure your shims individually, and then add up the numbers to get your total. Don't just measure a stack, because it's probably gonna be a little bit different. And when we're talking thousandths of an inch to that third decimal place, a couple thousandths might make the difference. So we're probably also gonna have to set this up a number of times and make some small adjustments. I'll talk about that later, but odds are this isn't gonna be right. New pinion, new ring gear, new carrier, everything's gonna be machined a little bit differently than what was originally in there, but that's where that inner pinion bearing setup race is gonna make it much easier. Let me make that shim pack, and then I'll show you what it looks like and how we're gonna put it back in the axle.
A few moments later.
After taking out those shims, cleaning off all the oil, measuring all of them, I was able to actually only use two shims. I used one that was 30 thousandths, another one that was 9 thousandths. I was looking for 38, 39 thousandths, not that big of a deal. We're gonna have to make adjustments more than likely anyway. But before we put that pinion back in the axle, before we do the shims, before we do the baffle, all that kind of stuff, we gotta get our outer pinion bearing race put back in. So if you guys remember, we pounded out this outer race from the other side. Well, we got to pound it back in, and that race is actually going to sit on this ledge right here. So there's a trick to make this a little bit easier. We're actually going to heat it up with a MAP gas torch. If you guys saw me do the truss on this, I used that MAP gas torch to heat the diff, the cast housing, so that I could weld to it. Well, we're going to use that now to heat up the axle housing a little bit. And you're gonna wanna put that inner race in the freezer. Heat causes things to expand, cold causes things to contract. This getting nice and hot, that being nice and cold, should be enough to be able to get it in there by hand. Nice and careful because this is pretty hot, but this is extremely cold. So I'm gonna slide that down in there, and if it doesn't go in by hand, you can use the old outer race, set it on top with a bearing driver, and tap it the rest of the way in. So at this point, it's time to leave those extra shims off to the side, make sure they stay in a nice clean place. Take our baffle, take our shims, and our setup race, go pop this back in the axle. So guys, we're gonna hit it a little bit of brake cleaner one more time as we put things back together, because a little burr, anything like that, any little grime that may have fallen down in there will make a big difference in your setup. Now the first thing we're gonna put back in there is our new baffle. Now you'll notice this baffle actually is indented in the center, so if you look at it, it kind of rises up on this side. You want this indentation part, the part that kind of rises up, to face toward the drive shaft side of the axle. You want the indentation to face toward the ring gear, so we're gonna set that in like that. Now we're gonna take our shims. These are what we'll adjust to adjust that pinion depth. More shims pushes the pinion toward the center of the axle. Less shim thickness will move it farther away. We're gonna lay those right in there on top of that baffle. And now guys, we take that setup race. That way if we need to make any adjustments, it's nice and easy for us to do. We're basically just gonna carefully drop that guy in there. With that done, when we lower this pinion down in there, it should, hopefully with any luck, have the right pinion depth. It won't. I'm sure we'll have to make probably 5 adjustments to it. You want to load this bearing with a little bit of gear oil. So just go around the edge, pour some gear oil in this bearing, spin it around a little bit, make sure it's got some in it, because that will affect your preload. It'll also maybe slightly affect your pinion depth. You just want to make sure that it's lubed up and that it doesn't go in dry. Gonna take our pinion, lower it down in there carefully as to not mess up our baffle anywhere. Then we're gonna just tilt the axle just a little bit here. Nothing crazy. We want to tilt it enough to where we can basically get everything on the back the way we need to. And now if you guys remember, it's the next shim pack we have to build, and we had that crush sleeve eliminator on this axle. Now if you watched my 14-bolt Regear video, there was actually a metal sleeve that took the place of that crush sleeve, and then we threw a couple shims on top to make up the difference in the height. On this one, we actually don't have anything to measure off of to actually make up the difference. You can get kind of creative with a set of digital calipers. I like to start at about 64 thousandths. I've just done it a bunch of times, and starting at 64 thousandths will kind of just usually seems to work. I've done axles before where 64 thousandths was perfect, and then I've done them where 64 thousandths was a little loose and I had to adjust it a little bit. All right, made our shim pack. Gonna slide that on first. Then we're gonna take our old pinion bearing that we honed out the inside of. Gonna slide that guy on there. Our old thrust washer, light coating of gear oil on that. Then we're gonna take our new yoke, slide that guy on. Then you're gonna wanna use your old pinion nut, because we're gonna use the new nut, but only on final assembly when we're done. I put that on, I torque it down to 200 pound-feet with a torque wrench, and then check our pinion bearing preload. Now there's a cool tool that we'll use for that, but I'm not gonna show you how to do it just yet because I have to make some adjustments. I can tell that this is way too loose. So at this point, I'm gonna pop it back apart. I'm gonna take out those shims that I just put on, and I'm gonna decrease the shim thickness just a little bit. If I decrease it a touch, it's gonna pull those bearings together a little bit tighter. It's gonna allow me to have a little bit more pinion bearing preload. It should not turn that easy right now. Now inside my Yukon Master Install Kit booklet, this Dana 60 tells me that I need between 17 and 30 inch-pounds of resistance on that pinion bearing preload. And if you guys saw me put it on before, you may be asking yourselves why I didn't use the pinion seal. Well, in order to uninstall that pinion seal, you have to ruin it. So What I do is I set my pinion bearing preload at the absolute low end, 17, 16, 15 would even be okay. Just outside of the low end of spec. That way when I throw that pinion seal in there, plus some new bearings, and it jumps up that pinion bearing preload, I usually am still within spec. If I'm not, I have to pound out that seal, take it all back apart, make a small adjustment, and then try it again with the new bearings. But usually it works out for me doing it this way. Now I'm gonna use the socket that I obviously use on that pinion nut and an inch-pound torque wrench with a dial indicator. Now it's basically impossible to see on camera, so I'm just gonna stick it on there and kind of start moving with it. And when I move with it, it should give me the resistance that it takes to turn this on this gauge. Not the initial start and stop, because that's gonna see a little bit of a spike on the dial. But as you start spinning it, it'll actually give you the reading of inch pounds. I did it 4 times, 5 times, I can't remember. But it got down to the point where I had to make an adjustment of 3 thousandths, and it went from being 30 inch-pounds, which was the max without the pinion seal and without new bearings, to just under or right at 15 inch-pounds, right? 3 thousandths difference. And it dropped me. Now 15 thousandths is outside of the spec on the loose side, which you would never want to do. But remember, we put that pinion seal in there, it's going to jump it up a little bit. We put a new bearing in there, it's going to jump it up a little bit. And it might wind up being on the high end of tight. But as you can see here, I basically took notes. I labeled second try. I decreased it to decrease the space, squeeze them tighter, still 0 preload. Decreased it yet again, 10 inch-pounds. Went down here, decreased it again, I had 30 inch-pounds, and this was the last try, and I'm sitting right at 15 inch-pounds. So guys, just take your time. But now that our pinion bearing preload is set. Now I know what you're thinking. That carrier, that's the old carrier. That certainly doesn't look like our new locker. But just like our pinion, we're gonna set up our new locker slash carrier a little bit differently than we set up the old one. But we do need a baseline. So we're gonna use the clamshell bearing remover tool to actually pull off both bearings on our old carrier. Now with that bearing removed, there are a stack of shims on there, and we need to make sure that we keep these in the right place, because this is the side of the carrier that the pinion rides on. We're gonna call this the pinion side of the carrier for future in this video. So we need to remember that these are the pinion side shims. Don't worry about measuring them just yet. We'll get to that in a few minutes. You gotta flip the carrier over, pull the other bearing off, remove those shims, and make sure you keep them separate. So we have both our shim packs over here, and now we actually have both bearings that we pulled off. Now it doesn't matter which bearing you use to cut up, but we have to cut one of them up. This one I'm gonna use to actually make our setup bearing by honing out the inside, just like we did with one of those pinion bearings you saw before. This one, you can see I've already actually cut it here with a cutoff wheel, and that's so I can peel this cage back, drop the bearings out, and now I'm left with just the inner race. We're gonna use this to actually press on our new bearing in just a little bit, along with a bearing driver. Now there's a lot of reasons why I use Yukon. This is one of the major reasons. Now if you look again at the pinion side of the locker or carrier, you'll see this little tiny pinhole. Well, that little tiny pinhole is actually for this guy. This is our air actuator, and when we actually hook up this copper line, air goes through the copper line, which basically just fits on by hand and blows air into that hole, activating our locker. Now, because that just goes on by hand and comes off by hand, our bearing actually sits down here, and the shims go between that actuator and the bearing, making it super easy to make adjustments. So we're gonna head over to the press. We're gonna take our new bearing, just put that on there, use that inner race that we cut apart just a minute ago, line up that old inner race on top of our new inner race, and then put our bearing driver on top of that, and then press it in. Now with everything set up in the press, you're gonna wanna go really slow. Make sure you press it down on even. With that bearing pressed all the way down so that the inner race is sitting on the shoulder on the locker, we can remove our bearing driver, And then we can remove and lift off our old inner race. And you see how it allowed it to get past this edge, but the old inner race didn't get stuck on there. So it allowed us to be able to get the job done. So with that new bearing on this side pressed on, we flipped the carrier over, and I'm gonna make our setup bearing for this side. After a few minutes, this guy slides right on there. That's gonna make it super easy to adjust both our carrier bearing preload as well as backlash. Now I'm gonna get to talking about both of those things in just a couple of minutes, but before I can do that, I have to go back to the original shim packs that were on this original carrier. I need to measure them out with the digital calipers. Now you guys have seen me do that in this video. You know to keep them clean and then take your measurements, write them down separately and add them up, not as a pack. So our original shim pack thickness had a lot of shims to make 53 thousandths. Well, I only used a few and I made 51 thousandths. So we're only 2 thousandths off, but again, I'm gonna have to make adjustments, but there's a trick. When you're doing a locker instead of a factory carrier, you're gonna actually use a different shim pack that comes with the locker for the air actuator side. There are a ton of shims in the factory install kit, and that's because it gives you enough to make shim packs for both sides of your factory carrier. Because the bearing goes on first, then you put the race on, then you stack on your shims. These shims that came with the locker are actually the right diameter to fit around the seal housing for the locker and go on. Now there is a master shim in here, and that has to be used no matter what to make sure that you have the right spacing between that air actuator and that little pinhole. So make sure that master shim goes on first, and then you build your shim pack based off of that. The master shim will be the thickest one that's in here. Measured it out, and I ended up with 36 thousandths, just shy of the factory 40 thousandths that were in there originally. I took a few thousandths off each side because the factory setup in there had so much preload on those bearings, it was crazy. And with this truss on the axle, plus the front truss I'm gonna have to put on for the full hydro steering, this axle is not gonna flex around or move, and all you need is enough preload on those bearings that it's not moving around at all. It just has to be a little snug. Now there are two terms we're gonna have to talk about. One is carrier bearing preload, very similar to pinion bearing preload. We'll get to that, and that's the first thing we're gonna focus on. And once we have preload, then we're gonna focus on backlash. We're gonna take the shims, we're gonna drop them on, then we're gonna take our setup bearing, and we're gonna drop that on the top of those. Now, when we drop this back on, we're also gonna make sure to use the new races. Even though we're using an old bearing on this side, that's okay. We wanna use the new bearing races to test it out. Now, this side's a little bit more difficult, and it's a little bit different from the other side. What we're first gonna do is make sure that we put a little bit of gear oil inside of that bearing. We're just gonna pour it in there, give it some turns. We gotta do the same thing on the other side before we put it in. You're also gonna wanna take some of the excess and lube up the surface here where the seal housing is going to sit. Now the seal housing has two separate sides, and it's time to put this guy together. I kind of unbent and uncoiled this copper line a little bit, give us some room. And you'll notice this side of the seal housing has a couple of ridges on it. The other side is flat. Now, these two rubber O-rings are the sealing rings that fit inside of the seal actuator. So we're gonna lube these up with gear oil. And then on the inside of this actuator, there's two grooves, and basically these sealing rings just kind of fit in there. Gonna take the other one, do the same thing, put it on the other side. We're gonna set our race down on top. Then we're gonna take our seal housing actuator and actually take the shims and put them on the actuator first. You can see that the shims actually fit around that outer ridge there, kind of holding them in place. I'm gonna flip it over, basically start to work it on. Now you gotta be really careful, and that's why you want everything lubed. You want those rings lubed, and you want the housing surface that you're pushing this down onto lubed. And then as you get it on, kind of work it around in a circle and press it down with even pressure, and it just pops right on. And this is where it actually gets tough. We have our case spreader already on there. we have a little bit of pressure on it. This truss didn't allow it to spread all that much, but we gave it a shot. We cleaned off everything on the inside where the bearings are gonna ride. We have our pinion already set up down inside of there. Now, we're gonna drop it in. So we're gonna kind of line up both sides and count to 3. 1, 2, 3. I don't have enough preload. I can grab this ring gear, basically lift it, and it just comes right out, which means I need to add a couple thousandths to each side, try to drop it back in again. I'm basically just gonna get this to where it's kind of snug and I kind of have to push it or hit it with a rubber mallet in order to get it to go in. All you need is enough shims in there to where your ring gear doesn't want to move left and right on its own. Now, carrier bearing preload, as we mentioned before, is just pressure on those bearings. It basically holds our ring gear at a steady position in this axle and stops it from moving left to right. Once you have that total shims, that total shim count is not gonna change. Where it is gonna change is how we adjust our backlash. Now, backlash is how close this ring gear is to our pinion. And we can measure that with the little clunk that's in there right now. Now that clunk, just by ear and just by feel, we're probably pretty close to within spec right now. And that's great, but it's gonna change because our preload is not correct. So once we have the preload correct, then we can adjust our backlash. And if we needed to move the ring gear any closer, we would just take a couple thousandths from this side and add them to this side. The total amount of shims isn't gonna change because we wanna keep the pressure on those bearings. We're just gonna change which side they're on. That way we can move the ring gear this way or this way according to how much backlash. And then once we're in spec, that's when we'll run our gear pattern and check our pinion depth. So guys, this is a complicated process. You're gonna have to put it together and take it apart a bunch of times, but that's where you need to make sure each step is correct. We know we have our pinion bearing preload already set. So if we need to adjust depth, we'll just adjust those bearings kind of the same way we're gonna adjust it here if we have to adjust it for backlash, right? The total shim pack's not gonna change. We're just gonna change where they go on the pinion. Same thing on the carrier. So at this point, I'm gonna pull it back out. I'm gonna add a couple thousandths to each side, and then I'm gonna sit there and try to drop it back in. Once I have it nice and snug, I'll show you guys how we check backlash.
A few moments later.
So we got our bearing preload set. There's no more movement side to side, and it was pretty tough to get in there. But what I essentially did was end up with 59 thousandths on the ring gear side, 43 thousandths on the pinion side, preload, check. At this point, we're gonna check backlash. As long as that is within spec, we can run our first gear pattern. But first, we need to reinstall those bearing caps, tighten them to 80 pound-feet, because that's spec for the Superduty Dana 60. And then I'll show you guys all about backlash. I'm gonna come in with a flat blade screwdriver and put it just inside the airline. There's like a flat spot here, and give it some light taps, not putting any pressure on the airline itself. And you can see with each tap, it moves forward. So as soon as I torqued down the bearing caps, my backlash, I don't know, I think it's a little tight. We'll have to see. The way you do that is with a magnetic base dial indicator. I'll put one like the one I'm using in the description. I'm not sure that they make this one anymore, but we're basically gonna set it up, and this measures in thousandths. Now, factory spec for this axle is between 6 and 10 thousandths. So we're basically just gonna take this, set it down on the housing, flip it to the on position. That's gonna give it a pretty steady place to measure off of. We will kind of move it into position here and play with it until we can get it directly where I would like it to be on the back side of one of these teeth. We're gonna zero out the gauge, give it a couple of taps, make sure it's actually on 0. And then I'm gonna roll it the other way, and this will determine how many thousandths we have. Right now we're on the 0, so let's see what we can do. See, I'm at 5 thousandths. Now, the way you increase backlash is by taking this ring gear and moving it farther away from the pinion. Knowing that I added 3/1000ths to each side, I'm gonna take the 3/1000ths from this side, put it on this side. That way the total amount of bearing preload doesn't change. The total amount of shims are still in there, but we are 3/1000ths farther away from the pinion. That might increase me to being within spec. Then at that point, we can run our pattern. 0, let's see where we're at. 10/1000ths. I don't like 10/1000ths, right? I'd rather have 7/1000ths worth of backlash, but it is technically within spec. And because it's only the first time we're gonna run our pattern, we're gonna check it. My tin of gear marking compound. Now, Yukon does send you some gear marking compound in the kit. You typically just mix it with gear oil, get it to be a nice thick consistency, and then you paint it on your gears. I do it often enough, so I just kind of have my own tub of it here. But we're gonna basically paint the drive side and coast side of 3 or 4 teeth. I typically like to do 4. You're gonna wanna make sure it's nice and evenly coated. Now what you wanna do with these 4 teeth painted when you run your pattern is basically reach under the axle and turn the pinion. That will rotate your ring gear. But you wanna turn it both ways through the pinion. That way you get a pattern on your coast and on your drive side of your teeth. Like I said, we'll talk about that in just a second. So I'm gonna put my hand over the ring gear, being careful not to mess with this copper tube. It does break very easily. Just give it some resistance and kinda send it through. Then we'll do it the other way. So before we get started talking about the pattern, let's chat about the different parts of the tooth and what they mean. You'll notice right here on this tooth how it's kind of more horizontal and this one's a little bit more sloped. The horizontal side, or the side that's steeper, is going to be called the drive side of your tooth, and the sloped side is going to be called the coast side of your tooth. Now all the way down at the bottom here where the tooth kind of grows out of the ring gear, that's called the root, and this top flat edge that really doesn't ever contact anything is called the face. Now the inside edge of the tooth is called the toe, and the outside edge of the tooth is called the heel. Typically you want your pattern perfectly centered between the toe and the heel, and perfectly centered between the root and the face. That'll leave you kind of like an oval shaped smudge in that gear marking compound, perfectly centered, and that's kind of what we're looking for. Now, your manual that came with your ring gear will show you acceptable patterns because it doesn't have to be perfectly centered, but the first pattern we ran, it's pretty awful. Let's check it out. My tooth pattern is way too shallow. You can see at the end of the tooth toward the face, you can see that there's that hard line and then it kind of has that swooping half oval toward the root. That means I am too shallow. As far as centering it between heel and toe on the coast side, we're okay. But let's walk around, let's look at the drive side. Okay, so you can see here, the drive side is actually closer to the heel and still too shallow. So we're gonna move it in a little bit deeper. We're gonna reset our backlash, try again. All right guys, so now we need to increase the pinion depth by, I don't know, 5/1000ths, let's say. So what we're gonna do, if you remember before, this pinion was set up in there and we said the pressure between the bearings created our pinion bearing preload. Well, we had a stack of shims over here that set our bearing preload, and then we had a stack of shims under the race, and that's what gave us our depth. So if I add, let's say 5/1000ths under that race, I have to take away 5/1000ths from where we set our preload, because the total number of shims has to stay the same so our preload stays the same. So at this point, we don't even really need to recheck the preload, provided I take 5/1000ths away from here, move it to this side. And that way it's 5/1000ths deeper, but the distance between the bearings is still the same. It's kind of the same thing we're doing with backlash once we have our carrier preload set. The total amount of shims doesn't change. You just have to move one from one side to the other side depending upon what you're looking for. So I'm gonna make the pinion a little bit deeper. I'm gonna recheck my backlash, because as you affect pinion depth, that pinion is kind of cone shaped. It will affect your backlash. and then we'll run another pattern. We're gonna keep playing this game until we get it right and we're happy with the pattern, and then only then do we take it back apart one final time to put back in our new bearings. I'm gonna go do that off camera. You guys understand how it works at this point. I'll show you the final setup and then what we do with that air locker to get it fully installed. All right, guys, I think I got it. With the bearing caps torqued down, my backlash is at 0.008. Preload is good. Pinion preload is good. And I adjusted the depth a couple of times, but I added in overall about 10 thousandths worth on the depth. And here we are. With the drive side on the left and the coast side on the right, you can see they're both pretty centered between the heel and toe of the ring gear. They're also both pretty centered between the root and the face. I'm overall really happy with this pattern. So at this point, we're gonna take it all back apart again so we can put on our new bearing on the ring gear side, put on our new bearing on the pinion, make sure that we get our new race inside where we had that setup race, put it all back together. But before we do that, we're also gonna drill and tap the housing for the airline. So let's get that done. Let's wrap this up. With the new bearing on there, with our shims, this guy ready to go. With the pinion removed, you can reach down in there, remove the baffle, shims, and old setup race all together. Make sure you take the race away, check the bottom of it, make sure none of the shims were stuck. With that stuff removed, we're going to install the new inner pinion bearing race the same way we installed the outer, by using the MAP gas torch to heat the housing while the new inner race is being frozen. It's pretty hot, so we're going to carefully lower our baffle and our shims back down there. Then we're going to take our race and try to get it in there without burning ourselves. We'll see if it goes in. It's close, but it's not going in. So we're going to go back to using the old inner bearing. We're going to set it on there, a bearing driver, and just tap it in. All right, now with that race in there, it's time to drill our hole so we can install the bulkhead fitting for our airline. Now with Yukon, you need to tap that at 1/4 inch NPT thread, which means we have to drill it out with a 7/16 bit. If you're using a different locker, it may be slightly different. Make sure you follow the manufacturer's install instructions. We're basically just gonna drill directly through the center of this hole on the truss. Guys, this is a great opportunity for you to mess up your job here, because we are gonna be drilling and tapping and throwing a bunch of shavings down in that housing. So I'm just gonna put a whole mess of paper towels in there to kind of catch as much of it as I can, make sure I clean it when we're done. So when it comes to tapping something, if you've never done it before, it's not all that hard, but it can be a little bit intimidating. You're gonna use something like this, okay? This is a tap for female threads. It's 1/4 inch NPT. It's labeled on the side, just like your drill bit probably was. And it's real important to make sure you use the exact size. Don't use like one drill bit size smaller or larger, otherwise it won't work. And you're gonna want something like this. This is a handle specifically made for a tap. The problem is mine's too small. This tap won't fit in there. I lent mine to someone, never got it back. I have 2 of these, but it's too small for this guy. What we're gonna do today is not the orthodox method of doing it, but I have done it before, and that is to use a socket wrench. And if you use a 1/2 inch 12-point socket, this 4-sided tap will actually slide right in there. Now, you want to make sure your tap remains nice and clean. You want to go in, you want to go maybe a 1/2 turn, 3/4 turn, back it out. Spray it out, lube it up, do it again. Back it out, spray it out, lube it up, do it again. And each time, go like a 1/2 turn or so farther, and then back it out. Because you'll have little bits of metal in here that you are cutting out of your hole, and it will provide more and more resistance to the point where you can snap off your tap. You don't want to do that. All right, and after lots of cleaning, we are backing it out, and you'll see some nice shiny threads down in there. So that guy is tapped and ready to go. With the locker and ring gear back in, bearing caps torqued down, we're gonna go to the other side, set up the pinion. Once we set up that pinion, we are gonna have to pull the carrier and locker back out one more time just to make sure that our pinion bearing preload is set correctly. That new bearing is gonna tighten it up, like I said earlier, as well as the seal. We wanna make sure we're still within spec. The only way to check that is without the carrier in here. So we are gonna have to pull it back out, hopefully for the last time. So we're gonna take our shims that we have here for our pinion bearing preload, slide those in there. Then we're gonna take our new bearing after putting some oil in it, drop that on. We're no longer using that setup bearing, but that guy did not go all the way down into the race. So at this point, we have the pinion pointed at the ceiling. We're gonna drive that in. So with the Yukon bearing removal tool, remember this diameter here was the perfect diameter to push on that inner race. We're just gonna kind of center it up here, give it a couple of whacks. Now, you don't want to hit it harder than you have to with the hammer, so we're just going to carefully monitor it as we tap it down and drive it in. Now, I'm going to make sure that this pinion seal fits this yoke, and it does. It's nice and snug on there, which is exactly what we want to see. And now that I know it fits, we're going to put this in with a tiny bit of RTV around the lip. I always do that just to ensure a good seal. And then we'll put this guy in. Now the key to these is you want to drive them in straight and level. So just gonna move all the way around it with nice light taps of the hammer. Now at this point, because that seal's in there and it's basically dry, we're gonna take some gear oil and we're gonna put it around the part of the yoke that's gonna slide through it. That's gonna help it move without increasing the preload too much. Be sure to only use the new washer and the new pinion nut with final assembly. Make sure you put some red thread lock on that pinion nut and torque it to 200 to 250 pound-feet. Plenty when you're using that crush sleeve eliminator. If you were using a crush sleeve, you'd want to torque it much tighter. With the airline hooked up and my bulkhead in there, we are done. Guys, pat yourselves on the back. This is a huge job. And I know this video was long. I know it was very technical and very detailed, and I appreciate you guys for all the support. Leave me a comment below if you use a different method to re-gear your axle, because there are some different ways of doing it. There are some other tools that I could have used, may have sped up the process just a little bit, but they also cost more money, right? I do things here in my two-car garage in a way that they're kind of budget, or as budget as they can be, to still use good parts and make some really strong stuff. And now that I have this axle done, now that my 14 bolt's done, we're gonna throw everything back underneath the CJ frame that you can see back there behind me and actually start to put a motor in it and really make this Jeep look like something. So make sure you guys subscribe, share this video with anybody that's curious about how to re-gear a Dana 60, and it's pretty easy, guys. You just gotta do each step within spec and you'll be fine. Have some patience. But anyway, get out there, make sure you build something.